Hi, hello, vanakkam, and welcome back to yet another episode on Little's Law YouTube channel. So, in our previous videos, we saw about various listeners, the very basic listeners, which is the view results tree, and then we saw about the summary report and aggregate report, and we also saw the differences and the commonalities of these two reports, the summary and the aggregate report. So today in this video we will see about the fourth listener, which is the aggregate graph. So this graph includes the aggregate report. So we can see here it has the same set of metrics which we had in the aggregate report, but on top of it we have the option to display the values in the graph. So this will give us an graphical representation of the statistical data, which is the response times or the the response time percentile, which is collected during the load test. And in fact, this displays the results of the test in the form of a graph. So that is the major advantage. That's why this is displayed as, or this is called as aggregate graph rather than aggregate report. And the x-axis represents the elapsed time of the test, and the y-axis represents the metrics which is being measured. So here we could see the various columns that we want to display. So by default we can see the average response time is selected, but we can add the various other response times. For example, I can choose the minimum and maximum response time, and we can choose the foreground color. In case if we want to make any changes, we can make changes to the foreground color. So to create an aggregate graph, we will need to create it using by right clicking the thread group, go to add and listener and choose the aggregate graph. So in the aggregate graph we can see the average value of the performance, the response times, and then we have the median, which is the middle value of the metrics to measure. Then we have the 90th percentile, the 95th, the 99, which we have already discussed in the aggregate report. And then we have the minimum, the minimum value of the metric, the performance time, the response time, and then the maximum. And then we have the error percentage and the throughput, the received kilobits per second, the sent kilobits per second. So to view the aggregate graph, we will have to need to run the load test and then select the aggregate report listener in the JMeter tree. So this graph will display the listener's UI, the user interface, and we can also customize the appearance and the data displayed in the graph by using the options in the listener settings. And one more thing, it's very important to note that the aggregate graph is just one of the many types of listeners available in JMeter, and it is generally used in combination with other listeners to get a more comprehensive view of the performance of our test. So that's the reason we are using this aggregate graph. So let's now run the test and see how does it work. So again, I'm using the same two requests which I'm using for my previous demo. And we have two requests. One is 01 HTTP request and 02 HTTP request. And then I have the other previous listeners, and then I have the aggregate graph. So let's start the load test and see how does it work. And before that, let me welcome you all to Little Slow YouTube channel. If you have not subscribed to my channel, please do subscribe to my channel and support me. So let's move on to the video now, and I'm just clicking on start since I have. Let me just remove this and I will move to this graph and I will change the name to aggregate graph underscore results. Let's start running, and here we can start to see the samples coming in and the average response times, the 90th percentile, the 95th, the 99, and then the maximum, so there are no errors. And let's now move on to the display graph, and here we can see, so in the settings part I have chosen average, minimum and maximum, and that's the reason we can see the minimum, average and the maximum. So here we can see the legends of it. So the average is denoted in green color, the red color, the minimum in the gray color, and the maximum in dark gray. So even we can change the options, we can change the colors as well. And in case if we want to make any changes in the font, we can do it here. And even if we want to draw any outline bar, we can choose it. In case if we want to show any number grouping, we can choose it. And if we want to display it in vertical or horizontal, we can even choose it. So here we can see, so we have made the changes and we have displayed it. And now we have the column label selection. So in case if we want to make any selection, so we can choose it. So let me just click on the apply filter. And then we have the other options where in case if we want to add any title to the graph, we can choose it as aggregate graph. And when we click on synchronize with name, and when we click on display graph, so here we can see on the top of the graph, you can see the aggregate graph. So this is quite easy, or it's quite convenient for us to when we want to save it, it's very convenient for us to display it on the report. And even we can make changes to the graph title, and when we change it, it's automatically changed. And then when it comes to the graph size, so basically we have the dynamic graph size with which we can make it to be displayed in dynamic. But in case if we want to make it static, so we can choose the static way like 10 and 10. And when we click on display graph, so same way we can choose this dynamic graph size. And in case if we want to make any changes to the x-axis and the y-axis, even we can make that change as well. And then the legend part, so here it is on the bottom of the legend. So in case if we want to move it to the right or to the left, we can just move it to the right or left. And then in case if we want to make any changes to the legend of it, so even we can make that. So this will make the graph to be more presentable. And again, in case if you want to save the graph, we can save the graph in the location. So I've just given us aggregate graph as the name, and when we just open it, let's open it and see what is the current status of it. So this comes as a PNG file, which is the image format. So in case if we want to display or if we want to attach it to the report, we can automatically do it by just saving it to the external location or somewhere in the project, and then we can use it to display that in the result. So this will actually save a lot of time, and in fact this gives us a clear picture of how the response time is, and we can even see like how much response time does each response time have, or does each transaction has. So this is quite comfortable. But again, when we see with the previous graphs, like this is again quite similar to the aggregate reports. The only thing which is added is the graph part. And then in case if we want to make changes to the save table header, we can even just select save table header. And this is, again, it's very important to note that this aggregate graph is just one of the many types of listeners available in JMeter, and it is generally used in combination with other listeners to get a more comprehensive view of the performance of a test. So I advise you to use the aggregate graph in case if you have not used it previously, but this is quite easy and it's quite very useful tool in case if we want to find the bottlenecks during the performance test, and in case this will give us a more insight into the results. So again, talking about why to use the aggregate graph is in JMeter, it is very useful for visualizing the performance of our load test and understand how it affects the application. In fact, it allows us to see how different metrics such as the response times or the throughput. So here you can choose the throughput as well. So in case we can even choose the throughput, the median part. So this actually helps us to identify the patterns or the trends that may not be immediately apparent from the raw data. So when we see the raw data, we might not be able to see, but when we see that in the graph, we can easily find like which particular metrics is quite high. For example, so we might use the aggregate graph to see how the response times of our application changes as the number of concurrent user increases. So this actually helps us to identify the point at which the performance of our application starts to degrade, and it can give us an idea of how much capacity our application has different under different load conditions. And in addition to helping us to understand the performance of our application, the aggregate graph can also be useful for identifying the problems or bottlenecks in our test plan. Say, for example, if we see a sudden spike in the error part, so here we can see if we see any sudden spike in the error rate or a drop in throughput, it could indicate that there is a problem with our test configuration or with the application itself. And by analyzing the aggregate graph and other data collected by JMeter, we can identify the root cause of these issues and take steps to fix them. So overall, the aggregate graph is an important tool for anyone who is using JMeter to load test an application, and it can provide valuable insights into the performance and behavior of the application under different load conditions. So I believe this video would have been very useful to you. So until we meet you in another interesting video, it's Bhavar from Vasan Shanmugam and Little Slav.